When Vladimir Lenin seized power in Russia in 1917, he created the world's first socialist state. But other socialists said Lenin's dictatorship wasn't true socialism at all. Over the next 60 years, people who called themselves socialists, often disagreeing violently with each other, would rise to power in scores of countries all over the globe, until they ruled more than 60% of humanity. Hello, I'm Brett Baer. I have seen the future and it works. Those were the words of American journalist Lincoln Steffens after visiting the Soviet Union in 1919. Even though the Bolshevik Revolution frightened many people, for some, it seemed to validate Marx's prophecy that socialism was mankind's destiny. In this episode of the Unauthorized History of Socialism, the Communist Revolution spreads to China. Democratic socialism comes to Europe, and in the Third World, socialism emerges as a new path to economic development. But as socialism in its many forms continues to spread, it brings disappointment. Nowhere does the reality live up to the ideal. And so we begin in the newly formed USSR, that is, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. Vladimir Lenin died of a brain hemorrhage in January 1924. He was only 53 years old. But in his relatively short life, he had laid out a path to power for revolutionaries around the world.
What Lenin did electrified, excited, inspired, terrified different people all over the world, depending on their frame of mind. And one of the more curious things it did was it gave birth to fascism. Lenin had showed that you could take Marxist doctrine and sort of twist it all around. And there was Mussolini in Italy, and he says he too is a revolutionary. For him, like for Lenin, making the revolution is the main thing. And he says, well, if we could throw out the proletariat and put in the vanguard of the proletariat, maybe we could throw out the proletariat and put in the nation instead. And all over Europe, there were groups of socialists who suddenly became nationalists. One, but not the only one who did, was Hitler, who comes along and has this new ideology of National Socialism, which retains a lot of socialist principles, but adds on the implacable hatred of the Jews.
Benito Mussolini joined forces with Adolf Hitler to launch a world war even more devastating than the last. The alliance between Italy, Germany, and Imperial Japan placed Mussolini in bloody opposition to his old socialist comrades. In the end, the grandiose ambitions of fascism went up in smoke. The world last glimpsed Mussolini's body hanging upside down at an abandoned gas station in Milan. The very next day, Hitler shot himself. With the defeat of the Axis powers, the ideology of fascism collapsed. But the death of this strange offshoot only cleared the way for other branches of socialism to flourish. In the aftermath of World War II, communism spread like never before. The Soviet Union's military gains set the stage for communist governments to take power in Eastern Europe and North Korea. But communism's biggest post-war conquest was yet to come. 4 years after the war's end, insurgent communist forces in China drove the pro-Western nationalist government off the mainland. In January 1949, the communists marched into Beijing to declare the birth of the People's Republic of China. Their leader was a 55-year-old intellectual named Mao Zedong.
Mao was a true revolutionary. He did not believe in normalcy. He did not believe in routine. He disliked bureaucracy. What he did was to mobilize millions of peasants to join the communist revolution.
Mao gave the Chinese people what came to be called the Iron Rice Bowl, a promise of lifelong economic security at a minimum level. The price was submission. The party would come to control everything: the books people read, the clothes they wore, even whom they married and how many children they had.
Mao felt that one has to really not wait for changes in the social system at all, but change human beings just as they are at once. That means to re-educate them and cut them off from all previous culture. Lenin allowed his people to read the classics and had access to the old literature. And Mao cut it all off, and for a while all they could read is inanities in the so-called Red Book. So he had this idea that if you do that, you completely cut them off from the past and create new human beings that way.
For nearly a decade, China followed the Soviet model of nationalized industry and collectivized agriculture. But the results were disappointing, and Mao grew impatient.
He became disillusioned with the Soviet model, and he thought he could improve upon it and bring communism overnight. He was truly a utopian thinker. And so that is when, in the late 1957, he launched what has been come to be called the Great Leap Forward.
At the core of the Great Leap Forward was a new Chinese institution, the People's Communes, more than 23,000 of them, comprising more than 500 million people. By mobilizing the country's vast labor pool, Mao believed his experiment would catapult China ahead of the West in both agriculture and industry. But the country's frenzied commitment to the Great Leap Forward led only to impossibly high production quotas and inferior products. In one program, the government tried to speed up steel production by encouraging peasants to build backyard steel mills on communes across China. For raw materials, the peasants donated iron goods from their own homes, including woks and other cooking utensils. The steel produced was worthless.
Mao also emphasized on agriculture production. One way he thought speeding up the agriculture growth was to plant it more densely, and that's scientifically irrational, and that did not really increase the production. Very soon, in 1959, there was also some drought, flood, and sort of natural disaster, plus this human policy, and that became a killer combo.
The peasants were forced to work long hours every day. They were totally exhausted by this. They weren't getting enough food to eat. They were literally, in some areas, starving. And it is estimated that this utopian idea led to the death of 30 to 40 million Chinese peasants.
A century earlier, Karl Marx had dreamt of a society of complete human fulfillment, where a person might hunt in the morning, fish in the afternoon, and write poetry in the evening. He called it socialism or communism, using those terms interchangeably. But Lenin seized on the word communism, linking that label ever after with his distinctive form of dictatorial socialism, as practiced in places like Russia and China. But communism was not the only form of socialism to flourish after the war. In Western Europe and a few other places, A competing version was making new gains. It was called democratic socialism, or more often, social democracy. Its adherents believed in peaceful change, not violent revolution. They believed that the true humane and democratic essence of socialism could still be reclaimed from imposters like fascism and communism. At the forefront of the movement was Britain's Labour Party, which challenged Winston Churchill in the first general election after Germany's surrender.
We have shown that we can organize the resources of the country to win the war. We can do the same in peace.
As Britain went to the polls, socialism's greatest hopes rode on the shoulders of Labour's unassuming leader, Clement Attlee. Clement Attlee began life as the painfully shy son of a prominent London solicitor. The Attlees had a vacation home and 5 full-time servants. They were devout Christians and active in volunteer work.
The first thing you need to understand about Clement Attlee is that he came to socialism despite himself. It wasn't where he wanted to be, it wasn't what he was brought up to be. He had the fairly automatic conservative opinions of a man of his class at that time.
Attlee graduated from Oxford and drifted into law. Then, one fall evening, his brother invited him to visit a club for disadvantaged boys in the notorious slums of East London's Limehouse district.
For the first time, he saw the conditions that the poor lived in England, that it changed his life. He saw children starving. He saw huge families crammed into tiny, squalid little rooms with no furniture and no food and no heating. He saw the utter misery in which the poor lived and compared that to the way he had been brought up. This made him a socialist.
Within a year and a half, the 24-year-old Attlee took over as club manager and moved in. The Limehouse district would remain his home for the next 14 years. In 1908, he joined a group of socialists within Britain's Labour Party.
Attlee believed that if people lived in slum houses, if they were sick and couldn't have proper medical care, they grew up to be different people from those who lived in prosperity. A canon of socialism is you have to change the physical environment if you want to improve human nature, and that Attlee certainly believed.
Attlee volunteered for combat during World War I and fought with extraordinary courage. As the government mobilized the economy for war, he and others believed that the same could be done for domestic purposes. In other words, that socialism could work. The influence of socialists within the Labour Party was growing. In 1918, they revised the party's constitution to support common ownership.
The British Labour Party was not started as a socialist party. It was started as a Labour Party, as a way for the labor unions to get some more clout or representation in politics. It then attracted more and more kind of middle-class intellectuals who were socialists. And in 1918, to make the middle-class socialists happy, the party adopts a platform which explicitly embraces socialism as the party's ideology. And where it does so is in this section that's called Clause 4, which basically said what we believe in is a society in which all the productive power is owned socially, meaning by the government or by the community.
Attlee rose to become the Labour Party's leader. During World War II, he was second only to Winston Churchill in Britain's national unity government. When the peace was finally won, much of Britain lay in ruins and the populace exhausted. In June 1945, the country held its first general election in nearly a decade. The choice was between Winston Churchill and Clement Attlee, two men who had joined together to fight the Germans, but now had different visions of how to restore the country.
Any British family, including the most devoted Labour family, if they'd been asked who they wanted round for supper, they would have chosen Winston Churchill rather than Clement Attlee any day. But Winston Churchill seems to stand for the old ways, for unemployment, for poverty, for no medical care, for an inadequate system of education. Attlee was a very much more withdrawn figure, very quietly spoken little man, with very little personal charisma. But what he stood for was what appealed to the British people.
By noon on July 26th, the results were becoming clear. Labour had won by a landslide.
Never before have the electors shown clearly their desire that there should be in this country a Labour government carrying out Labour's full policy.
Socialism had never won so clear a mandate.
The election was really fought on one issue, the welfare state. Attlee had a vision of a new Jerusalem, of a welfare state, of a city on a hill, of a society that would provide comprehensive national insurance. So this is a radical, reforming government which intends to transform British society.
Alongside the social welfare system, the other cornerstone of Attlee's new policy was nationalization. The famous Clause 4 was still enshrined in the party's constitution. Attlee now had his chance to bring common ownership to Britain.
Let's go forward into this fight in the spirit of William Blake. I will not cease from mental fight, nor shall the sword sleep in my hand, till we have built Jerusalem in England's green and pleasant land.
Attlee had published a book called The Labour Party in Perspective in the 1930s, but he reissued it when he was Prime Minister and with an introduction that re-endorsed the same points. And it called for complete socialism. And he went on to say that he wanted all large industry nationalized and that small industry could remain in private hands for a time. But his ultimate vision was a completely socialized economy.
Attlee's government would remain in power for 6 years. Before it left office in 1951, it had nationalized much of the country's industry and introduced an array of social welfare programs.
They took into public ownership coal, rail, steel, road haulage, gas and electricity. They created a national health service, free medical care for everybody. They instituted a system of pension by rights at a level which made old age dignified, if not prosperous. I mean, they had a pretty busy 6 years. I don't think any government has ever been as busy.
As the Attlee government put socialism to work, rebuilding Britain, the idea was being used for building a nation in another part of the world. A war-ravaged Britain could no longer support its far-flung empire. And one by one, colonies and territories began to break away from the mother country. 1948 brought the creation of the new state of Israel from part of the British trusteeship of Palestine. For decades, the Zionist movement had been struggling to create a Jewish state by settling Jews in Palestine. Many of these settlements were collective socialist villages called kibbutzim.
The kibbutz saw itself as socialist, but also at the same time as the expression of a national revolution. And they saw themselves as, in fact, the future Jewish society of this land.
Kibbutz Ginosar is nestled along the western banks of the Sea of Galilee. It was founded in 1937 by a group of young socialists, and it soon became the base of the Palmach, the elite commando wing of the Jewish Defense Forces.
We
wanted to influence the country. That was the idea. We wanted to influence the country and stand for equality and all the things we believed in.
Moshe Abbas came to Kibbutz Ginosar in 1940 when he was just 20 years old. In those early years, the kibbutz did not have enough tents, so he slept on the grass. But for Moshe and others, the sacrifice was worth it.
The
spirit of the kibbutz is what gave us the strength to live that way. Someone asked me once if I was religious, and I told them I have one religion, and that is the kibbutz. It covers everything you need.
The War of Independence came in 1948, and the kibbutz-based Palmach forces spearheaded the Jewish victory. With the support of the new state of Israel, Ginosar began to flourish. It built permanent homes, ran a profitable fishing operation, raised chickens, dairy cattle, and honeybees, and grew crops like bananas, mangoes, olives, and tomatoes.
I had never worked in farming or agriculture before, and I had never had to go by the decisions of a collective. But because what I'd been through in the past, all this wasn't hard for me.
Isaac Rotem settled at Ginosar in 1948. He is one of the hundreds of thousands of European Jews who came to Israel in the wake of the Holocaust.
I came through all the camps in Auschwitz, camps in Cyprus, and suddenly I felt like I was part of one big family. Suddenly you feel there is someone who cares about you, someone keeping up with you.
The kibbutz was socialism on a human scale. Instead of the government owning everything, as it did in the Soviet Union, and to a lesser extent in Britain, the community owned everything and made all decisions collectively.
The motto of the kibbutz movement was borrowed from Marx, which was, from each according to his ability, to each according to his need. There was no private property. Everything was shared in common, but it was all done in democratic fashion, that is, in group meetings or committee meetings where people could present their needs and the kibbutz would democratically decide what to do to make sure that that person had his or her needs met.
You did not need any salary because you got food in the dining room, you got clothes in the special store. At the very beginning, at least, you had no private clothes. The storehouse distributed every week clothes to the members. You could receive a shirt that another member had the week before.
Like many other communal experiments, including Robert Owen's New Harmony, the kibbutz even tried to reshape family life. There would be new roles for husbands and wives, and parents and children.
Half the kibbutz members are women, and the idea was that they would be liberated from, not childbearing, of course that's impossible, but liberated from bringing up their children, liberated from laundry, liberated from cooking, liberated from all the cares that women normally have. So they decided very early on that it was the collective's responsibility to raise the children. The children belong to all of us, and we are all responsible for looking after them. They wouldn't be under the tyranny of a bourgeois mother and father. They would be free members of the children's society, living with their own age group.
There was a notion of ben kibbutz, the son of the kibbutz, or the daughter of the kibbutz. In some kibbutzim, you even had that when a child was born, the General Assembly met and decided what will be his name of the child. how will he be called?
Ginosar's membership would eventually swell to nearly 400 adults. The kibbutz movement would grow to include 270 kibbutzim, with some 130,000 members, about 5% of Israel's population, and play a leading role in the life of the new state.
They marked out the border to start with, very much so, in the north, in the west, in the south, everywhere. Where there were kibbutzim, there was Israel. And they provided a major part of the agriculture. As time went on, they also produced a large amount of the industrial output. They contributed out of all proportion politically. The first two prime ministers were kibbutz members. The first cabinet of Israel, I think nearly half were kibbutz members. Army commanders, initially all the army and military commanders, these were kibbutz members. And I would go as far as to say that without the kibbutz, there wouldn't have been a state of Israel.
6 months after the fall of the Soviet Union, Mikhail Gorbachev visited Israel and toured a kibbutz. This, he said, is what we meant by socialism. But as we'll see, the members of the kibbutzim, who had democratically voted to live under socialism, soon democratically voted to abandon it. Please join me next time on the Unauthorized History of Socialism. I'm Brett Baer. Thanks for watching.